everyone. Welcome to the Cosmic Matrix podcast with Laura Matsu and Bernhard Gunther. Today's topic is going to be one that I'm sure many of you can relate to. It's about the ascend and descend and using our own suffering as a catalyst for awakening. And just to begin the podcast, we're going to start with a little reflection from Satprem, who is one of Sri Aurobindo's students, and he has his own take on this idea. So Bernhard will read it.
Yes, I'll quote Satprem. That's actually from a book I can highly recommend whoever wants to get into Sri Aurobindo's teachings of integral yoga. It's called Sri Aurobindo or The Advent of Consciousness, written by Satprem. And the quote goes as follows: "The higher one rises, the farther one is pulled down. Evolution does not move higher and higher into an ever more heavenly heaven, but deeper and deeper. Each evolutionary cycle closes a little lower, a little nearer to the center, where the supreme high and low, heaven and earth, will finally meet. The more light the seeker possesses, the more darkness he or she uncovers." And that also goes together with a quote by Sri Aurobindo himself, who said, "No one can reach heaven who has not passed through hell." And that actually also relates to a famous quote by Carl Jung, I believe.
It almost makes me wonder, because you know how like everybody misappropriates quotes, especially from Carl Jung. So maybe the no tree, as it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. Who even knows at this point if Carl Jung actually said that? I'll believe it when I actually see it in his book. Yeah. Because I know I've actually looked up certain quotes from him, certain famous quotes by him too. And I found, oh my God, like people just completely changed the wording. Kind of the general feel of the quote was still there. But yeah, that's an interesting... I mean, it's also just very common knowledge, I feel, in spirituality is like the further you go down, the higher you can go up. So... let's just get right into it. So I know that for you and for many people, I'm sorry if I'm laughing, it's just because it's so cliche, but like suffering, as the Buddhists say, is an essence of life. And I know that for you, they've been a huge teaching function. So maybe you can just kind of reflect back on your own personal experiences growing up and how your own sensitivities have opened you up to these experiences.
Yeah, just to maybe share a bit and summarize a bit about my own journey. And it ties into one of the questions I'm being asked the most, even in interviews and other podcasts I'm guest of. And people always ask me, how did I get into the work I do? Why did I get interested in these topics I write about and all of that? And I have a very simple answer in one word. It was suffering, right? Just on the very basic level, started already in childhood in the sense of literally not fitting in, feeling alone, not being able to relate to other people, having a very rich emotional life, being very sensitive, not being able to handle it because this is not what you're being taught in school. It always felt like an outsider. And it was not after, even high school, I didn't know what to do with my life. I went to University of Munich for a short period. But it was not until I found a creative outlet in the forms of playing the drums and making music when I really had an epiphany, an experience with something higher, something like almost a quote-unquote lightning experience, is that there must be, something like God or something that transcends all the suffering, all the, the thoughts I have in my mind, the judgments, and just the despair and depression I was feeling. So, as maybe some listeners know, I came to the U.S., Los Angeles, at the age of 22 to study drums and percussion, and really that, looking back, became my spiritual practice to play drums, right? It was like shadow work. It was really the heavy, dark music and processing a lot of anger, frustration, and all of that. But within that, it helped me on many levels, but I still felt more and more stuff was coming up for me, right? It was like a downward spiral, and even, 3-4 years living as a musician in Los Angeles, I was dealing with extreme depression and despair, and even suicidal thoughts were kicking in. I never attempted suicide. Well, maybe unconsciously because I got into pretty heavy drugs. And there was also a death wish behind it, so to speak. But in my journey, it just pulled me down so low, and again felt so lonely. And I remember this one day, I had a day job like every musician back in those days, or at the beginning of one's musical quote unquote career. And, just living by from month to month, and just, trying to make it as a musician and whatnot. And one day I woke up in my bed. I had to go to work, but I was in such a despair and depression. I was laying in fetal position. I started to cry. I didn't know what to do. I feel like, I was really paralyzed by the suffering and this existential loneliness and not knowing what to do with my life, and in that moment, I just surrendered to this feeling. Instead of fighting it, I surrendered to it. And I heard this voice in my head, you must, you need to figure yourself out, otherwise you will die. Otherwise I will kill myself. And that snapped me kind of out of it. And then I remember clearly I went to a random bookstore, right? And there was this book laying out on the bookshelf. It was called Freedom from the Gnome by Krishnamurti. And I was very drawn to it. It was almost there for me to purchase. And reading this book really, was an initiation in itself into deeper spirituality and spiritual philosophy and all of that. And, it was my start to, I need to understand myself. Who am I? The ultimate question, right? And, so not to go too long into it, it has been intense, intense phase of searching, of seeking, of studying spiritual literature, of reading psychology, got me into Jungian psychology and all of that. I got into esoteric teachings, more into the fringe as well, occult knowledge and all of that in effort to understand myself, right? And at the beginning, I had more an intellectual understanding of a lot of the concepts, even intellectual understanding of my issues, basic childhood wounding. But I realized I was fooling myself later on because my body hasn't processed it. I was not embodying the knowledge. I was not going through the process on an embodied level, right? And I was, I had realized a lot of unconscious self-defeating beliefs I had. For example, one day I clearly remember I realized I had this belief that I don't deserve to be happy. That if something good happened or some in my life, then right away the program came in, this cannot last, I don't deserve that, and all of that based on my guilt and shame programming. So all this stuff came up. But then I also realized then with basic mainstream psychology, it didn't really resolve because I realized in the quote-unquote mainstream, depression is almost seen as a mental illness, like something is wrong with you, right? You should be happy, take that pill, antidepressant. I never went on antidepressants, but that's most often how it is treated in the psychiatric institutions, right? And then I also, by questioning not only myself, but the external world, I realized that we live in the world, especially the modern world, which we're so proud of, is completely, with all the technological advances and whatnot and luxuries we enjoy, is completely removed from nature and spirit. And I realized deep inside that my depression in any way is actually a cry from the soul for readjustment. And then, going back to Krishnamurti, this quote really stuck for me from that book where he said, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And I feel that is what a lot of people are trying to do. They adjust to a world, to the matrix that is completely pathological, where pathology has become normalized, and then eventually they suffer, because there's a friction between what their true self, connected to the divine, truly is here to do and wants to experience, as opposed to the outer shell with all the conditioning and wounding. And then over time we can also numb ourselves, right? And, lose ourselves on this path, so to speak, not losing, but, making it hard on ourselves than it has to be. Because again, going back to this quote by Sartre and Sri Aurobindo, I just realized that the awakening process is this twofold process. You have to dive down into the underworld to be dismembered, the shamanic descent into hell, to battle demons within and without in order to rise higher. And it keeps going over and over again. It's like up and down, up and down. It's like this awakening process. It's not like I once thought in my romantic wishful thinking, like the New Age maybe tries to convey or pop spirituality to this linear road up to more love and light and heaven. But literally, it's a descent into hell, and you can rise only as high as low you have gone in your life, and it comes in cycles and cycles.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that part about wanting to buffer it up with antidepressants, because I did take that route. I think it was around age 14, I went to go see a therapist who suggested I go on antidepressants, and that was very interesting because I was actually just really sad, I think mostly because of unresolved trauma from my childhood, and then also just being in the world. I remember being almost shamed and laughed at for how sensitive I was, and I just found the world to be the opposite on how I wanted and how I felt it should be. In a weird way, I felt that there was all this unnecessary pain to it. So eventually it got to the point where I think my depression became very visible to my family, and they sent me to a therapist who automatically prescribed me antidepressants. And funnily, I actually had a lot of resistance to it. I would go on it, but I would recognize that they didn't work, or either they didn't work as fast enough as I wanted them to. So then I decided to self-medicate by just taking a variety of illicit drugs. And because I didn't really want to feel my suffering, that was really my whole goal. I really realized that I had this immense amount of pain that was coming up in my body, and I didn't want to actually be present with it because I felt it was too painful at the time. So I just I just ran through the gamut of different drug addictions in order to buffer up my feelings and desensitize myself, essentially. Looking back, when I realized I was dealing with multiple kinds of drug addiction for a good 10 years, the main reason that I got addicted was because I didn't want to feel suffering. That was the main thing. And if only I just, went to a therapist, it was always a mental process with the therapist, and that didn't help. What I really needed was just to be present with those feelings and develop that spiritual strength to be present with my suffering. So, I think it's also similar to what you said, the ascend and descend. I know for myself, I know people have had it definitely worse than I have, but I ended up in a detox center with prostitutes who had been sold by their mother into prostitution at age 12. I realized that kind of my lowest moment, I was surrounded by the depths of human suffering and really witnessed it in myself and in other people. And so, but there was also, it was weird, a voice in me said at that moment, you need to experience this then you can really see what humanity is dealing with. And at that point, actually, I didn't really, I thought it was almost my sick, kind of masochistic pleasure or something, which I'll also get into later. But I really realized that it's almost I feel there was a bigger soul lesson that I was becoming aware of, that I really needed to experience these depths of the suffering that people go through in my own journey. And then also just acknowledging later on and being able to feel and be present with my own suffering was really opened me up to deeper compassion for the suffering of others, which opened me up to being able to truly be of service to other people. Because until I actually learned to hold space for myself and those difficult and dark feelings, and really process grief and anger and all sorts of different, shame and guilt, there's no way I would be able to hold space for others who are going through that, because I feel unless we're really willing to sit with those feelings ourselves, how would it even be possible for us to demonstrate compassion for anyone who's going through it? And it's interesting too, because the norm of this world is to basically pretend to be happy all the time. Especially in Western culture, I find I'm from Canada, so it's a little bit extreme there, but it's this fake niceness and always pretend to be happy. And if you're not happy, then it's oh, what's wrong with you? Is something wrong with you? And I think there's a little bit less of a stigma around depression now, because there's been a little bit of a social justice campaign around mental illness. So, it's coming more out in the open, but generally, and we can intellectualize and be yes, it's okay if you're depressed. But I mean, have you really dealt with somebody who has like severe depression, because you really have to be an anchor unto yourself in order to hold space for those kinds of people. It's definitely not easy. Or holding space for someone who's going through intense loss or grief, which I think is like, that's the kind of suffering that really kind of cuts you down to what's important in life. Like anyone who's experienced a tremendous loss of somebody who's important to them, that's when like, that's the unavoidable suffering when you're faced with death and when you're faced with the impermanence of life. And there's nothing you can do at that point but surrender to what is, because you can't change death. So yeah. So maybe we can also, you know, you can talk more about how did you use your own suffering and how did you catalyze that into healing? Because I know for a lot of people, you know, they're feeling a lot of suffering, but especially now since we have these smartphones, it's so easy to distract yourself and not deal with it. And I think that when we distract ourselves and not deal with our suffering, it can manifest as a low level, either disconnection from your world or anxiety. So how do you actually make, even, I mean, through your process and on a day-to-day basis, catalyze your suffering into deeper healing? So how do you ascend from the descent?
Yes. Well, you're right. I mean, most people, like, it's naturally, we all like to varying levels, you know, it's the eternal pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. Nobody wants to feel pain and nobody wants to suffer, right? Consciously in a sense. And you're right. It has been, you see it also in our Western culture, especially in the US, especially on the West Coast, in a sense, this pretense persona, this fakeness of just like always pretending to be happy and I'm doing great. How are you? I'm great. You know, and all of that. And, you know, and like it ties into more what I call the disease of comparison, or being very concerned what other people think of us. Right. And ironically, in the sense from a spiritual, esoteric, even psychological perspective, the avoidance of suffering and avoidance of pain and avoidance of these feelings creates actually more of it. It just gets, you know, compartmentalized or stuck into the unconscious, the shadow, as Carl Jung may, you know, name it. But eventually it has to come out in some way. And whatever we don't feel and then process, whatever we have experienced in our lives, you know, can even come up later in life in disease or illness, right? So it's really important, what I realized, to feel these emotions we are afraid of feeling, you know, when guilt or shame comes up, not to, or whatever the emotion may be, which we label as negative, grief, you know, loneliness, sadness, even anger and whatnot. We try to escape them through distraction. A lot of distraction become addictions, right? Any addiction is really an avoidance of feeling what is. It's trying to escape our wounding and trauma. And as we all know, there's way more to addiction than just drugs and alcohol, as you said now, especially in this day and age where everybody's quote unquote addicted to various degrees to the cell phone, social media, the internet, Netflix, whatever, keeps us even head-centric, keeps us disconnected from our bodies and our emotions, right?
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. And for me too, meditation has really helped me. And I mean, I still act compulsively at the same time, but meditation has also really helped me develop a level of sensitivity. So now when I'm really suffering, not that kind of low level pain that you can experience throughout the day, I feel, which is also kind of normal for a pretty sensitive person. But when I'm really going through something and when I try, like, there's no way at this point that I can just go on social media or watch a movie, because I know that it's just, the buffering doesn't even work at a certain point. But for many people who don't get into that practice, it's also like you have to retrain your brain that when you're feeling this pain, you have to feel it. Because I think so many people have this very automatic Pavlovian reaction when they're feeling any sort of pain or discomfort. It's natural, and they don't even realize that they're suffering at a certain point because they're so used to almost like dancing around it as well. So is there any like you know, kind of practice you have whenever like some intense feelings come up? Like, what do you do with them?
Yeah, for me, it's simply that just happened recently, you know. Usually I feel it as a physical sensation in my body, and mostly most often it's around my chest, right? You may call it the heart chakra, or the chest is just something is condensed, something is blocked there, or most often in my solar plexus. You know, I feel just some uneasiness, right? Something even nauseous, a bit nauseous. So it manifests more as a physical feeling of uneasiness, discomfort in my body. So in the past, I would just like try to avoid it, maybe smoke a joint, go on Facebook, whatever, just distract myself, watch YouTube, whatever. But now when I feel it, I'm just sitting with it. And I'm really literally just similar basic meditation, just closing my eyes and feeling, body scanning, feeling the emotion, not the emotion, the physical sensation in my body, without trying to analyze it, without judging it, without even trying to change it, but just putting the awareness on it to really feel what is, not what it, but just putting consciousness on it, shining the light into darkness, so to speak. And as I do this, something starts to shift and I start to experience certain emotions, certain feelings come up. There's a feeling like, for example, recently, like just this sadness, and underneath it's this loneliness, almost like existential loneliness. And all of a sudden these negative thought projections come into my mind, self-judgment and all of that. And then as I, allow this feeling, physical sensation feeling just to expand more, then all of a sudden something happens and I started crying, as you witnessed as well. It just, tears come up in my eyes, and I just, this release of crying just helped me to transmute that emotion, just to feel it, right? To let it out is such a actually, ironically, a positive experience when you fully are able to express that emotion. And I'm not even trying to analyze what is it related to, what story it could be, a million and one things. I don't know, back to my childhood wounding, could be back to related to a past life, whatever, something happened today maybe, that triggered it. But I'm not trying to analyze it. I just want to feel the emotion, an emotion that I usually avoid feeling, and most people avoid feeling. And by feeling what we actually are afraid of the most and what we try to neglect, that's how we heal it, transmute it, and truly work through. And on the other side of the point of the equation, what I also realized, addiction and avoidance of pain or suffering is based on fear. Something bad may happen, or the fear of feeling this emotion, but having that fear of feeling it is actually way worse than feeling the emotion itself.
Mm-hmm. I made a joke, and sometimes, like, I forget, it was like a couple years into my journey, about like how like being a bit of a masochist actually works well for the spiritual path, because it's like you can kind of like embrace the suffering. And I think at one point I was wondering if I was almost like dwelling too much in it, but I changed my opinion later on that, which we can get into. Which is really about just embracing it as an essential part of the path. But I remember also very early on, I think it was in like 2013, I was talking to somebody who had a lot of buffers up, I'll have to admit. And they remember telling me, like, I never get anxious, I never get depressed. But the interesting thing about them is like when you scratched them a little bit, meaning when you triggered them a little bit, like they would rage and all sorts of stuff would blow up. And that made me obviously question whether or not they were truly telling the truth, whether they actually didn't get depressed or suffer, or they had just buffered it up to the point they were in complete denial. So what do you think about that? Are there people, can you avoid suffering is one, which I personally think, yes, you can avoid some suffering, and meaning unnecessary suffering. And are there people who just don't suffer, like who have it easy in life and just somehow skip that part?
Yeah. Well, I think everyone suffers. Not everyone, but most people suffer to varying degrees. But what I also realized, a lot of people suffer, but they don't know that they are suffering, is what you just alluded to. I feel when a lot of people have too many addictions, avoidance techniques, and it builds, how it is even said, Gurdjieff talked about in his work of building buffers, armor, right? Really protective mechanisms that keep you from keep you from avoiding certain feelings, and even keeps you in your head, keeps you disconnected from your body. And I see this as a body worker. Like so many people, sometimes come on my table and they say, "Oh, I feel great. Actually, it's fine. Just some tension here," but the whole body is just armored, and it's really hard, to even loosen up the muscles, because all the body holds so much of our emotions. Our body is literally our walking biography, right? There's a lot of memory, emotion stored literally in our muscles, in the bones, in our tissue, right? We carry so much of our past with us.
Yeah, I even still notice that on the daily basis. Like the other day, I went into a yoga class, and it was a heated yoga class, so they're also quite intense. And I was like, oh my God. I think you experienced it the other day when you went for a massage. It was like how much stuff you're holding on to until you actually get into the body and you're able to let it go. And I think too is like, unless you're really consciously working on these practices that release that, it's also humans have, I realize, a tremendous capacity for pain, and to also, that's why a lot of people kind of get stuck in their lives, even though they're miserable and they're just kind of numb, because they're in pain, but they have a tremendous capacity to get used to that pain as well. And that just becomes their new normal. So until you actually feel this freedom and relief for moments, brief moments, because it always returns, I feel, but you don't really realize how much pain that you're in. So like, I mean, maybe we can get more into this esoteric aspects, but are there people out there who you think just are not meant to suffer in their lives and they're totally have it easy? And these aren't enlightened people, by the way, but just normal people.
Yeah, I'm not sure about not meant to suffer, but the elephant in the living room, psychopaths, right? And we're talking about genetic psychopaths. I have written a whole article about it. There's a lot of research out there that there exists a type of quote-unquote human. Actually, it's based on recent research. It makes up 8% of humanity, of people who are born genetically without a conscience, not based on childhood wounding or trauma, but literally have no conscience, no ability to feel any emotions of compassion, empathy, regret, all of that, no love, no nothing. So they, you have to have conscience is a necessary ingredient to actually dive deep, to feel, to have empathy, to feel others' pain, to feel your own pain. So they're really, they're empty shells in that sense, not truly human, but they appear as human, look as human. I mean, they have a perfectly crafted mask of sanity, and they actually also learn to emulate emotions in order to manipulate others. Going back to our society, a lot of these psychopaths, which, by the way, psychopaths can have a high IQ, and they're not necessarily the serial killer, we hear about, or Hollywood type film psychopaths, but they gravitate towards positions of power. They can be politicians, CEOs, can even be prolific spiritual leaders and whatnot, but they hide behind this mask of sanity. They're like wolf in sheep's clothing, and they don't experience this suffering, which they actually consider a weakness. That's what they see in other people when they suffer and are weak and whatnot, and that's what they then take advantage of, so to speak, by manipulating that, by feeding off of other people's suffering, actually.
Yeah, and then even a higher percentage, as we live in a society that rewards sociopathic behavior, like especially in the business world, like you're not supposed to get your emotions involved and not supposed to feel compassion for others. It's very cutthroat, and you can succeed by acting in this way. So even if people aren't completely psychopathic, which I feel is very hard to even people who are like kind of born sociopathic are very hard to heal. It's actually pretty much impossible, arguably. But then there's also people who may also have like a soul or a spirit underneath there, but they've adapted so many sociopathic tendencies, which create these buffers. And also narcissism can create these buffers. So there's, even if you're not like fully like a psychopath or a sociopath, you can still have these narcissistic and sociopathic tendencies, which keep you from actually feeling suffering. Because if once you start feeling the suffering, the soul has to come forward and has to confront and also recognize, some aspects of itself that it doesn't want to look at as well. So I feel like for the most part, like anyone has felt into their heart also feels like this tenderness of pain of being in this world. And that's also a really important element of being able to demonstrate true compassion and empathy, is to be able to feel what other people are going through because you have that open and tender vulnerability. So...
Yeah. Well, that reminds me again, it goes back to Krishnamurti's quote about there's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And as you just said, we live in a world where pathology has become normalized, right? Narcissists have become role models. so to speak. And that's what people think that they need to do as well. And they buffer themselves up. And as you said, with regards to compassion, empathy, or even what I shared with my process, it was feeling this emotion in my body. I want to also say I was not always able to do that, and not everybody a lot of people, even as much as they want, have trouble accessing their emotional self because there's so much in their head. So the key is also to get into your body in a conscious way, because through body-mind practices and all of that, through receiving body work, right? To relax, again, because everything is stored in our body, right? And the ancient yogis also obviously understood the body-mind connection and developed the physical asana yoga practice to relax the muscles, because it relaxes the mind, to get the nervous system into parasympathetic nervous system, into a relaxed state. And that's when also the body intelligence kicks in. The soul comes to the front and helps to reveal everything that needs to come up and be healed and transmuted in order to anchor to the divine, in order to raise truly to a higher frequency, so to speak.
Yeah, and that whole fight or flight response, it's actually a response we have towards pain as well. So whenever we feel pain, it's natural. It's you burn your hand on the stove, automatically you're going to want to take your hand off of it. And not to say that you should burn your hand on the stove just to endure suffering, but it's an automatic and natural reaction. But it's also learning to be kind of a true spiritual warrior and be I'm going to feel this and have it come up. And what you said just reminded me too, because I've done meditations where I'm just focusing on the heart, the psychic center, and the soul. And for at least 30 minutes into the meditation, I would feel just numb and nothing. And then all of a sudden just feel really intense pain. And I basically had to give it that much presence in order to bring it forward, because who knows what kind of armor and kind of protection I had up before I was able to access it. So I think what people kind of mistake as peace is just really their armor covering things up. Because what I've also noticed too, more and more, is I thought that through my own spiritual practice, I not so much now, but I had this illusion, Adyashanti says, I thought I would get more comfortable and everything would be bliss. But what actually happened is I started becoming more sensitive and feeling more pain. And I think that's the true role of the bodhisattva, is to be in the world and feel this tenderness and still being able to act beyond that vulnerability and fear and use that as a way to be of service to others.
Yeah, it reminds me of, speaking of Adyashanti, he has, paraphrasing his quote, but he says, especially nowadays, everybody is woke as fuck, so to speak. And, everybody wants to awaken. And like he said, a lot of people they want to awaken, but what they're really saying is that they would just want to be happy in their dream life, right? And make the personality happy and actually avoid the true process of awakening. And like he said as well, enlightenment is actually a destructive process. It reveals, that's what I know, it reveals everything that is not aligned with truth and regarding truth of your being, your divine being. And it shines a merciless light into everything that you have been avoiding, where you've been lying to yourself. And the key ingredient in this process is radical self-responsibility. Because what I've also noticed in my own path, people start on that journey, especially at the beginning, more unconscious level, we easily fall into the victim or blame trap. So whenever we feel shit coming up or something happens in our lives, we tend to blame others or situations for our state of being. Or we fall into what I've done into victim, into self-pity, right? Self-pity, self-blame, and taking self-responsibility, by the way, does not imply that you blame yourself either, right? That's very important, because I've done this a lot in my past and sometimes still slip into it because I'm not awakened. Triggers some ancient guilt and shame, right? When it becomes get lost in these emotions, and I think a key ingredient in this process is to feel these emotions but not identify with them. That's very important. Not that you are not the sadness, you are not the pain, you are not the guilt, the shame, the anger, whatever, but still not push it all away and deny it, just feel it but not identify with it.
That reminds me too, because through my own meditation practice, what would happen? Because initially I find the reaction. So if you're feeling any emotion that's uncomfortable, like sadness or anger, there's this human impulse to be like, this is because that happened. And you create this whole story in your mind because that's the impulse to want to put that pain somewhere outside of you so you don't have to become responsible for it. And I noticed, because through my own meditation practice, my thoughts started kind of disintegrating. Not to say I don't have thoughts anymore, obviously, but like I just started having less of those stories going on in my head. And what would happen is when I felt suffering, it would just be this visceral feeling, like all of a sudden I would feel this way and I wouldn't grasp for a story to attach to it or some sort of distraction. I would just have to feel and be present with this. And then it actually almost heightened the feeling as well, because I find even the story that we want to attach to it can lessen the pain. That becomes a way of blaming and distraction when just feeling it coming up, because I realized more and more, especially at some moments too, like really when I was in like some really, I guess, more intense moments in my journey, I remember just feeling like immense pain in my whole body. And I realized what I was actually tuning into was almost just the suffering of the world, like the essence of what it means to be human. Like it's really, I mean, I feel like it's just an uncomfortable situation, because like when you're truly aligned with your soul, which is really infinite, but you're also stuck in this mortal experience and you're stuck in this constant change, and there's so many basic elements of life which have suffering woven into them. And yet we live in this world that tries to deny them and avoid them. So we're caught in this just grand illusion in that way.
Yeah, that reminds me also, with regards to what you just mentioned, I can see this in myself, how the mind is a trickster and wants to give a reason right away to anything. And I've fallen many times in the trap, which I call analysis paralysis. You know, like the mind trying to find exactly like some cause or reason, this is happening because of this or that. Or, you know, we both use astrology. It can be a helpful tool, but it can also be used to buffer things up, to avoid certain feelings, to just rationalize them, right? To blame transits or, you know, aspects and whatnot. Or you can even, you know, go to childhood wounding and what happened with your parents, because non-parents were perfect. We all are wounded to varying degrees, right? And I think it can be used as a tool, using the intellect on some level, but you can easily get caught up because so much comes into the equation the mind cannot possibly understand. Because it can, you know, again, can be related to something past life, karmic, something working itself out. Then what you mentioned, a big aspect, especially in this day and age, during what we call the time of transition, this bigger quote unquote awakening is happening and more is revealing itself. And a lot of people are struggling and suffering, you know, that I've noticed it more and more in my life, and I know you as well, that we literally sometimes pick up the suffering of the collective, of other people you sometimes surround yourself. And it's really important to discern what is yours and what is not yours, especially so-called empaths, which is a word that has been very hyped and overused in this day and age, I feel. But some people are just more sensitive, right? But it, you know, it's also it's not about using that as an excuse either. Oh, I'm an empath, I'm so sensitive, right? Which I've done definitely myself, and then isolate ourselves. But being able to stand your ground, to shield yourself, you know, to stay grounded, to stay in body, most importantly, right? And, you know, through a consistent spiritual practice, especially meditation, to tap more into your true self, to bring the soul to the front, and being able to separate what is yours and what is not yours, right? And that also ties into more, which we go in, I think, more in depth. We'll get into the second hour of this podcast, into occult interferences, occult hostile forces, entity interferences, the whole hyperdimensional matrix and thought injections that need to be actually rejected and not integrated. And that's, you read this in every esoteric teaching, especially Sri Aurobindo and his integral yoga teaching talks about, you know, the things that need to be integrated, but certain aspects need to be rejected as not part of our nature. And this rejection doesn't mean to suppress things either. And most people ask, so how are you able to make the difference? Well, that really depends on your level of being, on your spiritual development, and being able to, you know, fuse the mind and body and really connect more to your true self within.
Yeah. And also, like, on a simplistic level, if someone is blaming you for how for how they're feeling, that's always not going to be yours to take on. Like, and that will happen, especially with people who are not on like a growth path, I guess you could say. But that's the automatic condition of the world, is like, and even like, you know, like you and I, like, we still fall into those patterns in our relationship, like learning how to take self-responsibility. Like, yes, we can affect each other as well, but like trying to blame the other person for what we're internally experiencing is not going to help us, I think, essentially. Yeah. And I guess reminds me of one quote too, sorry, just to get into it. So it's from Shinzen Young, who's a Zen teacher, I believe. Don't quote me on that though. And it's, compassion is to share the pain without sharing the suffering. So I feel like pain and suffering are two different things. And I noticed, especially when I started working more with like understanding the concept of boundaries, like energetic boundaries and our own boundaries that we create in ourselves, and how the ability to say no, is that like, so when I was in the world before, I would sense what somebody was feeling, and then I would almost take personal responsibility for it, and I would start taking on their suffering, and I would think that that was helping them. But now, it's, since I started really understanding boundaries and how they work, it's to be able to identify how they're feeling, and then also maintain my own connection within and my own steadiness within, so I can actually truly help them.
Yeah, and that also reminds me, going back to the general topic of suffering, you know, and a lot of people, is suffering necessary? Do we actually, you know, would be the initial question of this podcast. And as I came to realize, you know, in my own evolution or life path, that suffering was a catalyst to start seeking truth, to start working on myself, right? To find deeper meaning within myself, to question everything, you know, my own life, my own beliefs, my thoughts, question everything I've been told and taught. And that's almost the paradox, the irony in the equation, because suffering is almost necessary as a catalyst to start the path, but the path, you know, we engage in the path so we can finally transcend suffering, so we don't suffer, right? That's the ultimate, the enlightenment, like to transcend duality, right? To become whole, right? To self-realize, so to speak. And you see, you know, I don't know one person who has embarked on this path who has not suffered. Mostly that's the whole purpose of suffering, in a sense, right? To ask deeper questions. And most people, you know, like everything has it's an initiation, so to speak, rather than a big mistake we made, right? And if you look at it from a more holistic sense, all the suffering, or, you know, in the past, the love-bad relationships I've been into, or whatever hardship I've been through, have been actually deeper initiations from a spiritual shamanic perspective, rather than, oh, I fucked up, I did this wrong, or somebody hurt me and I'm poor me and all of this. But it was there's a deeper lesson behind that. And it also reminds me of something the mother said, the mother being Sri Aurobindo's partner, when the student asked her, what is the purpose of suffering? Why do we have to suffer? And she answered with something very profound. She said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, that suffering is the only force which can awaken matter out of its inertia, right? It's part of the awakening process, this friction, right? To crumble, and like it ties into many other quotes by spiritual masters, by Rumi, like, you know, you have to break your heart until it opens, and things like that, you know, and the only way out is through, right? To make the darkness conscious. Again, Carl Jung's famous quote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious.
Yeah, and now I have a completely different perspective. I think that, you know, normally when people see people going through like a major death or car accident or one of those really humbling life moments, they kind of express sympathy, like, poor you, like, and they don't really know how to take it for the most part. I think the general response is like sympathy, being like, oh, poor you. And now it's funny, like when I see people who are going through, like, especially, I remember one of these sharing circles at the Eco Village I'm living at, some woman was like going through like a death of both of her parents, a divorce, like losing her home. And all I could think, because of what I had gone through, was like, oh my God, you are so ripe for a spiritual awakening right now. And also being able to see it as a blessing, because I know that, like, a lot of people, I think, are kind of just drifting along in their comfort. And it's only those moments which I feel like are handed to you by fate, which wake you up. So that kind of like low level comfort that people get used to when they're just getting distracted or they're avoiding their lives, like a lot of them actually aren't experiencing suffering, but all of us at some point of our lives are going to be completely humbled by either losing a parent or someone that's really close to us. Car accidents are a really normal one, major threatening illnesses. All these things are things that are natural processes of life, which actually make us ripe for a spiritual awakening.
Yeah. And that also reminds me of, like, because we're so caught in our ego consciousness in our mind, when something bad happens, we're so involved, the emotions come up. It can be very overwhelming. It can't make any sense. The fight and flight kicks in, you freak out, you panic, your life is falling apart and all of that. But there's some, what I've noticed, there's a saying, you can only connect the dots when looking back. Mm-hmm. When I look at all my experiences, the quote unquote good or bad from my ego consciousness, because only our ego consciousness divides, this was a good experience, it was a bad experience, right? But there's an unseen, how can I say, path, like that has been also laid out from my higher self, from the divine, I don't know. And these experiences were almost also like orchestrated in terms of, with regards to divine grace, but tough grace, right? That I realized a lot of these life-shattering experiences like you just described from this person or in my own life, actually in that moment were horrible, bad, negative, and sometimes drove me almost to suicide, but were a major wake-up call. Was like a necessary step for something much better I wasn't aware of at that point back then.
Yeah, and that actually kind of, maybe you can lead us into another topic, which sort of reminds me too, like we've gone through some intense experiences in our relationship and they've been very painful, but I've realized every time it happens, we just strengthen and deepen our love because we're able to go through that together. And it's really like, it's not only, I feel, when you go through suffering, do you strengthen the connection to your soul, but when you go through suffering with another person, you strengthen your connection to them. So maybe we can also just touch on how I feel like a lot of people, I mean, this is also the conditioning of our world where it's like, all of a sudden it's a codependent relationship. You're going to meet your partner and there's going to be this happiness and security and comfort. But I remember this quote by Eckhart Tolle, relationships are not here to make you happy. They're here to make you conscious. So how do you feel that relationships can be a catalyst for our own healing by introducing more suffering to our life?
Well, I have to say, though, I partly disagree because, I'm very happy in our relationship. But definitely it has brought up a lot, especially as at the beginning. I mean, from the get-go, we had like, not all, every relationship is different. And that's a whole podcast on its own about relationships, but it's also about the X factor that you have this compatibility on a deeper level. Like the saying, like from The Little Prince, true love is not looking into each other's eyes, but in the same direction, right? And both partners need to be really committed to the growth in the relationship, right? If one person is not and the other one is, it's unfortunately, it's doomed to fail at some point, right? But also having, already done a certain amount of self-work on your own to be able to spot your triggers, right? To take self-responsibility, to be able to hold space, what you said before, to show compassion, empathy. And sometimes it's not easy when stuff comes up in intimate relationships, as it has not been easy with us. But each time when these difficult things came up, which, by the way, I also realized a lot of the stuff, I've done so much work on myself. I've spent a lot of time single and secluded and just working on myself. But I also realized I had hit a wall. And most of the stuff that comes up between you and I wouldn't have come up on my own, but needed to come up, right? That's really the true meaning of a conscious relationship, to use it as a catalyst for alchemical transmutation and reveal what's been hidden, the shadow and whatnot. You can interpret it in that way. But as you said, when you're really able to feel yourself through it without the blame game, without blame, defend, attack, and all of that, right? And own it and feel yourself through it and let these difficult emotions come up, which sometimes related mostly to PTSD from past relationships, which we then project into the present, or childhood wounding, or occult interference, which again we'll get into a bit later. But as you mentioned, even like the process I mentioned before, when I feel into my heart and feel the tension and feel the pain, feel the sadness, the loneliness, and just cry. Even our relationship, we both have cried, but the more we have processed that in a conscious way, with self-responsibility and without blaming the other person, it truly has strengthened our relationship. It really has created even more love, more depth. And I realized the more I was going, into the underworld, into the pain, into the suffering, the more I was able to ascend to a higher level. And even within our relationship, the more we committed to the process and working through these difficult emotions, the stronger our love bond became it's like it's endless, so to speak. It just grows stronger and stronger onto higher levels.
Mm. Yeah, and I remember this moment is when we first met. We were just like in bed together, and I started crying because I realized like there's a touch of sadness to all joy, especially when like I knew I had spent so much time alone, and this moment would pass as well. So it's almost like joy and suffering go hand in hand, or the joy and the pain go hand in hand. Because I feel like when you truly understand the impermanence of life, I know it's cliche, but it's true. Everything's constantly changing. And if you truly love someone, you also have to recognize that one day you're going to lose them, or they're going to lose you, or whatever. Like there's going to be a suffering attached to it, and just recognizing in the moment, not like, like doing sometimes as I do, where I'm like, one day you're going to die, but also just accepting that, and then also you use that in every moment to be more appreciative and more grateful for the connection you have while you have it, because you know that it's not going to last forever. And then that helps you also not take things in your life for granted, in your relationships or in your life in general.
Yeah, and really in a true evolutionary relationship or conscious relationship, people really need to deprogram themselves and let go of any notion of Hollywood romance, which is most often mistaken as love, right? Because stuff will come up, there will be conflict, and it depends also on the level of being, depends on the purpose of the relationship, depends what this two people are here to do, right? There are many different levels, and it's without judgment of what level of love people can access, based on the level of being, based on their soul integration, right? So, archetypally speaking, or generally speaking, everybody wants to feel love, be with the perfect partner, have their dream wife, husband, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, their twin flame, right? But, that ties into, all these, nonsense topics of, what a conscious man should be acting, and, a conscious woman, and all of that. And there's almost this entitlement expectation, when in fact you can only attract that who you truly are and have already integrated within yourself, right? Which also ties into the alchemical marriage of the inner male and female, how you have unified these polarities within yourself, which will be reflected, like your relationships literally are a gauge for where you are at. They act as a mirror.
Yeah, it also reminds me, I think, especially in hoping that a relationship will somehow make us happy, and at that point it's happily ever after and everything is fine. It reminds me of this quote from Pema Chodron about, and the Tibetan Buddhists actually have a word where they combine hope and fear, and they see hope and fear as being two sides of the same coin. So the quote is, as long as we're addicted to hope, we feel that we can tone our experience down or liven it up or change it somehow, and we continue to suffer a lot. In a non-theistic state of mind, abandoning hope is an affirmation, the beginning of the beginning. You could even put abandon hope on your refrigerator door instead of more conventional aspirations like every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. We hold on to hope, and it robs us of the present moment. If hope and fear are two different sides of the same coin, so are hopelessness and confidence. If we're willing to give up hope that insecurity and pain can be exterminated, then we can have the courage to relax with the groundlessness of our situation. When we talk about hopelessness and death, we're talking about facing facts, no escapism. Giving up hope is encouragement to stick with yourself, not to run away, to return to the bare bones, no matter what's going on. If we totally experience hopelessness, giving up the hope of alternatives to the present moment, we can have a joyful relationship with our lives and an honest, direct relationship that no longer ignores the reality of impermanence and death. And that also reminds me, just touching back maybe on just the topic of this loneliness you feel on the path and the sadness that you continue to feel. And I've heard this from many different teachings, is like the bodhisattva, the person who's really here to be of service to the world and with an open heart is constantly in this place of tenderness and vulnerability and on the verge of tears almost. And I've also realized that there's an essential loneliness that came along with it. I realized I could either kind of just be stuck in this socially conditioned way of relating to people and these false personalities, or I could move beyond that. And the more that I felt I worked on myself, the more lonely I got, because like no one at a certain point, it was like I had become so like present and with my own emotions that most of it, like nobody was able to do that for me. And then it also led me to the experience. I realized that like I'll never truly understand what you're going through. Like I can have empathy and compassion and kind of see it and feel it, but I'll never truly understand what you're going through. So maybe you can also talk about, like, I know that you've written an article about that as well, about how loneliness is this essential ingredient for taking the spiritual path.
Yeah, loneliness on the path has its higher function or purpose, similar as suffering in the sense, because the lesson of loneliness is also to develop solitude, to be okay when you're alone, when you're in solitude with no one around, if you don't distract yourself, you don't use others trying to fill a hole in your life, right? You don't depend on others for your happiness and whatnot, right? It's more the whole, it's an archetypal normal process of the awakening process. You hear about it in any esoteric teaching. Once you have crossed the threshold, so to speak, there's no turning back, right? You cannot see what you have, you cannot unsee what you have seen, right? You cannot go back to your old self, and you cannot go back, you take the red or blue pill. Once you take the red pill, Matrix movie, that's it. And you have to, in any esoteric teaching said, you have to keep going, right? And there's no turning back. Otherwise you will just, suffer even more. So that loneliness has also its function because it helps you to extract yourself from even relationships, situations or life circumstances that were not good for you to begin with. So people fall onto your lives naturally. You cannot relate to them, and that's fine. It has its function. And the worst you can do, which we maybe all do, is trying to convince others, right? Trying to convince, especially, in a relationship, somebody wakes up, the other person doesn't wake up, and then they want to change the person. They have the hope, like you just alluded to, that she or he will also change in the future. That's usually a trap. Mm-hmm. The whole hope bit you just quoted, and the danger of hope makes a lot of sense when you even use it in the matrix, so to speak, in the political spectrum. There's a reason Obama used hope you can believe in. Mm-hmm. It's very manipulative of this something future will happen and everything will be okay, right? Avoiding the present and the all, like Sam Krishnamurti talked about, an ideal is just an escapism, right? You're not dealing with what is. So loneliness in my path really helped me. Now, I moved here in Topanga, spent many years, almost a decade by myself, reading, studying, in nature. And it helped me to actually provided the time to dive deeper into my own process and dealing with this feeling of loneliness and confronting it. And that, forced me to really find the ultimate connection with God, the divine. What is God? What is divine? What is my true self? To go deep inside. And then, there are experiences I'm sure you can relate to when you pierce through it and feel actually this interconnectedness of all that is, that there's actually no separation, right? And it's not this state stays forever. It's not in the sense of I'm not enlightened in any shape or form, but you can sense more the interrelatedness, right? That you're truly not alone ever. And this loneliness is just an illusion, but you may, understand it intellectually, but not experience it. But it has its purpose. But even like you just said, even in our relationship, we are so connected, and, it's really hard to connect to people in general. We are like best friends, lovers, brothers and sisters at the same time. There's this amazing unseen connection, and we have even a very strong psychic connection. We feel each other very We cannot hide anything from each other, so to speak. But still, this is your experience, this is my experience. And sometimes I experience this existential loneliness. Sometimes it just comes up. And it has nothing to do because you did anything wrong. It's just there, right? It just drags me down again, right? Into the descent, right? And just to clear up whatever needs to be cleared up.
Yeah, that reminds me too, is whenever I went through my most intense experiences of just like visceral suffering, like really feeling it and not attached to any story, but just like, it was almost like, it like almost felt like a heart attack sometime because of how painful it was. I remember these moments, and I don't know if it was just because of the contrast or the relief, but that's when I would be like riding my bike in nature, and I would just feel so connected to everything. It's like almost like I'd be like my heart had broken wide open. And it also just reminds me of this quote about the warrior attitude also being extremely sensitive. So maybe you can just close it off with this. The situations of fear that exist in our lives provide us with stepping stones to step over our fear. On the other side of cowardice is bravery. If we step over properly, we can cross the boundary from being cowardly to being brave. We may not discover bravery right away. We may not discover bravery right away. Instead, we may find a shaky tenderness beyond our fear. We are still quivering and shaking, but there is a tenderness rather than bewilderment. Tenderness contains an element of sadness, as we have discussed. It is not the sadness of feeling sorry for yourself or feeling deprived, but is a natural situation of fullness. You feel so full and rich, as if you are about to shed tears. Your eyes are full of tears, and the moment you blink, the tears will spill out of your eyes and roll down your cheeks. In order to be a good warrior, one has to feel this sad and tender heart. A person who does not feel alone and sad cannot be a warrior at all. The warrior is sensitive to every aspect of phenomena, sight, smell, sound, feelings. He appreciates everything that goes on in his world, as an artist does. Her experience is full and extremely vivid. The rustling of leaves and the sounds of raindrops on his coat are very loud. Occasional butterflies flying around her may be almost unbearable because she is so sensitive. Because of this sensitivity, the warrior can then go further in developing his discipline. She begins to learn the meaning of renunciation. In the ordinary sense, renunciation is often connected with asceticism. You give up the sense pleasures of the world and embrace an austere spiritual life in order to understand the higher meaning of existence. In the Shambhala context, renunciation is quite different. What the warrior renounces is anything in his experience is a barrier between himself and others. In other words, renunciation is making yourself available, more gentle, and open to others. Any hesitation about opening yourself to others is removed. For the sake of others, you renounce your privacy, and that's from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. So, yeah, would you like any final thoughts on suffering?
A lot to be said. We're gonna go deeper into all of this, more into the second hour of this podcast, which is only available for members via my website, veilofreality.com. There's also a membership forum where we can all discuss these topics more. And in the second hour, we're going to go more into what I alluded to before, also into occult, hostile forces, interferences, entity attachments, implants, and all of that, which can also result in suffering. But, these kind of aspects need to be identified and rejected and not integrated from a psychological perspective, because on that note, we also talk about the limitations of psychological work alone. And I think we also should talk about the sunlit path, right? What I call about like there's necessary inner work, but then there's also, what I call, we need to pull out the weeds, but also let's not forget to smell the flowers on the path, so to speak, which is about, I think you talked about this, read me a quote about the Great Eastern Sun.
Yeah, the Great Eastern Sun, we could definitely go more into that. And it's just also, that's really about appreciating the basic goodness of the world, meaning not being like, I do this because I'm a good person, but being able to appreciate these moments in nature where it's just like, wow, this is a beautiful experience to be alive, and just being able to see that fundamentally, like, even though we're experiencing these feelings of pain and suffering, there is like a basic goodness in the world, which we can just focus on. And then that is kind of our experience of presence and relief of this crazy experience of being human.
Exactly. or some of us may not be human, which also I feel I want to get into the second topic in terms of loneliness, the topic of wanderers with star seeds. And I've written an article about that, bodhisattvas, people who came here with a mission profile and don't fit in.
Well, by the way, actually, I was reading today this book on Buddha, his life retold, and it talks about the incarnations before he became Siddhartha. And actually, there's a very interesting moment where I don't know where he got this information from. Who knows? He could have just made it up. But I think he got it from a compilation of text. But this moment where, who was meant to be Siddhartha Buddha, he's like deciding to incarnate in the world at a certain time, at a certain moment, because he has a certain mission. And it reminded me so much of this wanderers concept. So maybe we can go into more depth about that.
Definitely all of that in the second hour. Again, for the members, you can sign up veilofreality.com. See you on the other side.